So the concept for this game is essentially a mashup of some of my favorite aspects of games I really enjoy. I wanted to create something with really simple but addictive mechanics, and I remembered playing this game ski-free for hours on the computers in middle school, and so this idea of ski-free 3D was my starting point. But I don't want to create a skiing simulator, I want to make a party game I can play with friends. So I'm drawing influence from the multiplayer of Mario Kart, and I want to include some form of items or power-ups to make things more chaotic. And then finally, I was imagining what ski-free would look like in 3D, and I thought about the boulder scene in Crash Bandicoot, and the intensity of the on-rails Indiana Jones style camera view. I'd like to capture that very cinematic experience in this game. So, without further ado, let's get started. Now, I could have used these Unreal mannequins as placeholder character assets, but something about their shiny asses isn't working for me. So instead, I'm going to use my primitive Blender skills to model and rig a low poly character. And I'm not actually using any reference photos here, I'm just full on YOLOing this model, trying to get it rigged up as quickly as possible since it's really just a placeholder. I'm still kind of new to Blender and Unreal, but I'm slowly finding a workflow that works best for me. So, next up was importing the model into Unreal and creating an impromptu slope for our T-pose to slide down.
Open your eyes.
I'm flying!
After that, I spent a good 45 minutes on the basic skiing controls with keyboard inputs, and it was about this time that I realized I have no idea how the character movement components in Unreal work. But I did eventually figure it out. Kind of. Then I created some basic skiing peripherals. You know, like the pole thing and some skis. I wanted to show this because this is one area where my workflow has changed significantly since I started in Blender and Unreal. Basically, I set up my IK rig in Control Rig, and this allows me to animate in Unreal Engine. And basically the advantages of that are I don't have to constantly export from Blender anytime I want to make changes to animations, along with a bunch of other cool things that Control Rig can do. So after creating some simple IK controls, I can use those controls in Sequencer to create some basic animation states for the skiing character. Shortly after that, I realized that my player controls were pretty broken for any slope that wasn't facing essentially that exact direction. So I spent about a half day writing literal spaghetti code, figuring out how to interpolate rotation properly. But eventually,
It's working! It's working!
this was a fun part. I got to finally use the landscaping tools in Unreal and create something that kind of sort of looks like a snowy mountain or a ramp. And it's even sort of kind of starting to look like skiing. But it still looks a bit strange because he's not really responding to any of the terrain he's going over, and his skis are kind of sticking straight out of the slope. So I made a quick diagram to illustrate what's going on and some solutions I considered. Approach A is what's going on right now, where the character goes down the slope without any consideration for the angle of the terrain. Approach B is a pretty simple solution where you just rotate the whole character based on the slope of the terrain, and this definitely looks better, but no one really skis head first down a slope like this, and that's why I'll be using approach C, where we keep the player's upper body consistent, but you adjust the character's foot placement and rotation to match the slope. This can be done by casting a ray from the bottom of the foot to the ground, moving the foot to the ground based on some threshold distance, and rotating the foot based on the angle of the ground. And the nice part about this approach is that you do this for each foot, so potentially both feet could be angled slightly differently. In Unreal, I've implemented this as a separate control rig that behaves like a post-process effect, and it effectively keeps the character's feet glued to the ground. And I've added some interpolation speed here so it looks a bit more natural and doesn't happen immediately. Then I went back to Blender and made a little scarf for the skiing man to wear. I wanted something I could add cloth physics to that could help illustrate the speed of the character flying down the mountain. And also it just sounded like something fun to work on. And this was exciting. Seeing the scarf blowing in the wind and the feet pointing in the right direction, it felt like progress. But the camera was something I knew I needed to tackle sooner rather than later, and none of the solutions I found online worked exactly the way I wanted, so I came up with this path-based system using two separate splines. How it works is that the nearest point to the player on the red line is mapped to a corresponding point on the blue line, which will be the desired camera location, and then the camera is rotated to point directly at the player. This allows me to map out really dynamic camera movement in the course, and I've found it's also a great visual debugger. At this point it was time to use a more robust slope to test all these features, so I got to work modeling some terrain. Again, this was pretty much my first time using landscape in Unreal, so I was just kind of winging it, but I think it turned out well enough for the time being. After outlining the slope that I wanted, I started mapping out the camera path that would be used to follow the player down the hill. And the first test run was pretty cool, honestly. A couple days later, I came back and added some checkpoint flags, mostly just to keep things interesting while I was testing. One thing that I noticed when working on jumps and ramps is that the character would immediately lose all of their momentum when going up any type of upward slope. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, but that was kind of the turning point where I realized I needed to abandon this janky version of the character movement component and instead use physics-driven movement controls. You can see the rolling ball that I'm using to calculate character position here. Overall, I'm really glad I made this change when I did, and I think the physics-based movement turned out to be really satisfying. After this, I went back into Blender and messed around with some decals to use on the character, just to get a few more colors in the game. I also modeled some props so I could start filling out a few more areas of the demo level and test out collisions with ragdoll effects. I made these ice shard looking things to fill out the final part of the slope and spent way too much time learning about runtime virtual textures. Essentially, you can use virtual textures to share data about the actors in your scene with your landscape material and vice versa. I'm using it here to create this blending effect between the base of the ice shards and the snow beneath them. I also use this to print the track lines into the snow, and I'll probably be using them to create dynamic ski trails behind the player later on. Coming back to character movement, the player character was still feeling a bit rigid, so I added some leaning animations and threw them into a blend space. So now, based on the current turn angle, the character is always somewhere between leaning left, leaning forward, and leaning right. There's still a lot of tweaking to do, but it's feeling a lot better. Finally, I took some time to get multiplayer working. This was made a bit more difficult since introducing the physics-based movement, and testing multiplayer is a pretty tedious process, but eventually I got everything working. So that's it. Next time I'll be focusing more on multiplayer, building for different platforms, and maybe talking about art direction. Thanks for watching.